Then came the Indian Council Act of 1909, which is also known as Morley-Minto Reform. In view of the dissatisfaction of the Indians with the Indian Council Act of 1892 and the growing threat of the extremists, the British government decided to make certain concessions with a view to win over the moderates and enacted Morley-Minto Reform Act of 1909. It increased the strength of the additional members of the Imperial Legislative Council from 16 to 60, but still retained official majority. The strength of the Provisional Legislative Council was increased to 50, and they were to have non-official majority. The Act also enlarged the functions of the Imperial Legislative Council, permitted to discuss resolution on matters of general public interest, but their recommendations were not binding on the government. Further, the President of the Council could deny the members the right to discuss any matter or resolution on the ground that it was not desirable to do so in public interest. The members also did not enjoy any right to vote on grants or move a vote of no confidence against the government. The Act also increased the size of the Provisional Executive Council. But probably the most important provision of the Act was the introduction of communal electorate. The Muslims were permitted to elect certain members only from amongst Muslims. This way, the British hoped to wean the Muslim away from the national movement and drive a wedge between Hindus and Muslims. This provision was extremely disastrous in the long run, since it paved the way for the division of the country on communal lines. The Morley-Minto reforms failed to satisfy even the moderates. It failed to establish responsible government in the country insofar as the executive was not made responsible to the legislature. Even the system of election introduced under the Act was highly unsatisfactory. Not only was franchise very restricted, but the method of indirect voting introduced under the Act rendered the system ineffective. The provision of official majority in the central legislature was also disliked by the people. The Act also failed to provide sufficient control to Indian Legislative Council over Indian affairs. However, despite numerous shortcomings of the Act, it cannot be denied that the Act was a step forward in the direction of a responsible government. Then came Montego-Chelmsford Reforms Act of 1919. This Act is also popularly known as Government of India Act 1990, which introduced important changes in the home government at the centre as well as in the provinces. The Act considerably weakened the position of the Secretary of State in England by transferring some of his function to the High Commissioner for India and delegating some of his powers to the Governor General in Council. The Act reduced the strength of the Indian Council and also reduced its term from 7 to 5 years. The Act did not introduce any fundamental changes in the central government, which continued to be as autocratic and bureaucratic as it was before. Though the upper limit on the membership of the Viceroy's Executive Council was done away with and 3 Indians were appointed on the council, still it continued to be responsible to the Secretary of State. No doubt the members of the council legislature could criticize the Executive Council through questions, supplementary questions, censure motions, etc. But they could not vote the Executive Council out of power. Further, the Governor General continued to enjoy a position of dominance in the council. The Act provided a bicameral legislature at the centre consisting of the Council of States was to consist of 60 members, and its members were to hold office for a period of 5 years. On the other hand, the Legislative Assembly was to consist of 143 members, and its members were to hold office for a term of 3 years. The members of both the houses were directly elected. Even though on the basis of a very restricted franchise, the central legislature was given quite extensive powers and it was authorized to legislate for the whole of British India, both with regard to the Indian subjects and the servants of the government in financial matters. However, the legislature was not permitted to discuss certain items, even on some of the items which were subject to the vote of the assembly. The governor could sanction a grant which had been refused or reduced by the assembly. Thus, the legislature was virtually powerless before the executive. The most important achievement of the act was reintroduction of the system of diarchy in the provinces with a view to train the Indians in the art of self-government. The act divided the subjects into two categories, central and provisional subjects, and gave greater freedom to the provisional government to administer provisional subjects. The provisional subjects were further subdivided into reserved and transferred subjects. The size of the provisional legislature was also considerably enhanced. They were authorized to make laws and to provide governments to the provinces.